What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the BLU Bold N2 and the OnePlus Nord N200 5G. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a 6.6-inch AMOLED display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 390, an aspect ratio of 19.5 by 9, and a 90.9% screen-to-body ratio. With the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, we're getting a 6.49-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 405, an aspect ratio of 20 by 9, and an 83.7% screen-to-body ratio. So in general, for what they are, both of these phones have really good displays, but each phone has slightly different advantages here. With the BLU Bold N2, the biggest advantage of this phone is the display technology. With an AMOLED display versus an IPS LCD, the Bold N2 is going to have brighter and more vibrant colors and better viewing angles as well. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, the BLU Bold N2 is going to be a little bit easier to see than the OnePlus Nord N200 5G. And overall, if you're consuming a lot of content, like watching videos, looking at photos, that kind of thing, an AMOLED display is just going to look a lot better than an IPS LCD. But that being said, on the other hand, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G has a slightly higher refresh rate at 90Hz versus 60Hz, and this is going to make the movement on the screen a little bit faster and smoother, so when you're using the phone, it's going to feel a little bit more premium. And if you're doing something like watching a video or playing a game with a lot of motion on the screen, everything is going to look a little bit more fluid. In addition to this, with an aspect ratio of 20 by 9 versus 19.5 by 9, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G has a slightly taller and more narrow form factor, and that's going to give you a more immersive experience in landscape mode. And if you're doing something like reading an article or scrolling through social media, with a taller and more narrow form factor, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. Now, all that being said, while again both phones do have really good displays, in my opinion, the BLU Bold N2 does really have the main advantage, because with an AMOLED display like this, it's really hard to beat when you're consuming a lot of content. But that being said, again, with a 90Hz refresh rate, a great form factor, and a 1080p resolution, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G is really not bad either. Now for storage, the BLU Bold N2 is getting 256GB of internal storage with no microSD card expansion, and the OnePlus Nord N200 5G is getting 64GB, and this phone does have microSD card expansion. Now in general, despite not having microSD card expansion, the BLU Bold N2 does have a huge advantage in storage, with quadruple the space of the OnePlus Nord N200 5G. And honestly, unless you have a really large microSD card, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G is not going to come close to the storage of the BLU Bold N2. So if you're more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, then hands down the BLU Bold N2 will definitely be the better choice here. But on the other hand, if you're a really light user, if you only have a few apps and maybe a couple photos and videos here and there, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, while not being ideal with only 64GB, is still probably going to be enough to get by. Now for security features, both phones do have fingerprint scanners. With the BLU Bold N2, it's right here in the display. Definitely gives the phone a nice premium look, and with the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, it's right here on the power key, which is definitely a real convenient spot for a fingerprint scanner. And in addition to the fingerprint scanners, both phones also have face unlock as well. But starting with the BLU Bold N2, let's go ahead and give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. Moving on to the OnePlus Nord N200 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners worked real well, no issues at all. And again, remember, both of these phones also have face unlock, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the BLU Bold N2, we got a 16 megapixel front facing camera. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. For video, this phone has a max quality of 2K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. With the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, we got a 16 megapixel front facing camera as well. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. And then for video, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G has a max quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras. So as far as features go, both phones are pretty good, but with an ultra wide camera, the BLU Bold N2 definitely does have an advantage here. And in addition to this, being able to record 2K videos, while not being really that useful, especially compared to phones that can record in 4K, still is a slight advantage advantage over the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, they can only record in 1080p. As far as the actual photo quality goes, these phones are actually pretty similar in that regard, and compared to higher end mid-range phones, neither of them are really particularly impressive, but all the same, I do think the BLU Bold N2 does have slightly better quality. So in general, if the camera is more of a priority for you, if you're taking a lot of photos and videos, and you want the highest quality you can get between the two, I would say the BLU Bold N2 will be a better choice, especially since it does have an ultra-wide camera, whereas again, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G only has a macro camera. But that being said, if you don't really care about the ultra-wide camera, and you're really more of a light camera user, but maybe you still want a camera that's not terrible and still will get the job done, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G is definitely still going to be okay. As far as RAM and processor go, with the BLU Bold N2, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810 processor. With the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor. Now, I ran Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and with the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a single core score of 586 and a multi-core score of 1685. With the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, we're getting a single core score of 510 and a multi-core score of 1600. So between the two, while the BLU Bold N2 is slightly faster according to this test, in my experience, you're really not going to see a huge performance difference between the two, and in general, they're really going to be about the same level. But that being said, for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, that kind of thing, maybe streaming a couple videos here and there, and some light mobile gaming, either of these phones is going to be perfectly fine. But that being said, they're definitely not going to be nearly as fast as a higher end mid-range phone, like a Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G for example, or a Samsung Galaxy A53 5G. So if you're doing higher performance activities or just using your phone really heavily, you will notice, while again they're not bad, these are definitely not the fastest phones out there, and again they're really made for more basic activities. But that being said, in my experience, I haven't had any performance issues with either of these phones. Now for the battery, with the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a 4200 mAh battery that supports 30W fast charging, and with the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 18W fast charging. Now in general, while the BLU Bold N2 does have an advantage in fast charging, I feel like the OnePlus Nord N200 5G's larger battery really outweighs this. With a 5000 mAh battery, the battery life and overall longevity with this phone is going to be so much better, whereas with the BLU Bold N2, while the battery isn't really bad, and it will at least get you through the day, if the battery is more of a priority for you, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G is definitely going to be a better choice here. Another thing to keep in mind here is the OnePlus Nord N200 5G does have NFC, whereas the BLU Bold N2 doesn't. So if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, keep in mind with the OnePlus, you will be able to do this, but you won't with the BLU Bold N2. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, while it's not really a better device per se, I do feel like the BLU Bold N2 has more significant advantages. First of all, with an AMOLED display versus a regular IPS LCD, the BLU Bold N2 has a much higher quality image, so if you're consuming a lot of content, despite the OnePlus Nord N200 5G not being bad by any means, I feel like you're going to get a better experience overall with the BLU Bold N2. In addition to this, the viewing angles again with an AMOLED display are going to be a little bit better as well, so if you're outside in the sun for example, or really in any brighter situation, the BLU Bold N2 will be significantly easier to see. Aside from the displays, the BLU Bold N2 does have a lot more storage, and even though it doesn't have microSD card expansion, with the OnePlus Nord N200 5G only having 64GB of internal storage versus the BLU Bold N2's 256, you would really need a seriously large microSD card to catch up. And even then, if you're a power user, having more internal storage versus microSD card expansion tends to be better in general. In addition to this, the BLU Bold N2 also has an ultra-wide camera, records higher resolution videos, and takes better photos in general. That being said, on the other hand, while I do still think the BLU Bold N2 has better advantages, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G still does have some advantages itself. First of all, it has a bigger battery, so it's going to get better battery life and longevity overall, and it also has NFC, so again, you can use tap and pay with this phone, whereas unfortunately you can't with the BLU Bold N2. So overall, those are the main differences between the two phones. Again, I personally think the BLU Bold N2 is going to be better for most people, but if you do want a larger battery and NFC, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G is not going to be a bad option either. But this concludes my comparison between the BLU Bold N2 and the OnePlus Nord N200 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Cleepus Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.